Number 8. The Ghost Army. In early 1944, the U.S. Army established a top-secret unit of 1,100 artists, designers, and sound engineers to help win World War II through visual, sonic, and radio deception. Nicknamed the Ghost Army, their sole task was to fool the Nazis about the location and number of Allied forces. They achieved this by blaring sound effects that could be heard as far as 15 miles away and by playing fake radio chatter. The Ghost Army also deployed fake weapons and inflatable tanks, jeeps, trucks, aircraft, and other vehicles, making a single unit of soldiers seem up to 30 times bigger than it actually was. They did this from as close as a quarter mile from the front line. With a collective IQ of 119, the Ghost Army was one of the Army's most intelligent units. Its members typically worked at night under the cloak of darkness when it was easiest to create deceptive visual effects. When it came to radio transmissions, specialists learned the unique styles of known operators to make their reports all the more convincing. This highly specialized unit participated in more than 20 missions in Europe, including major operations like the D-Day landings at Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. Most members arrived in England in anticipation of D-Day in May of 1944. Later that year, the Ghost Army staged fake artillery and machines within the critical gap in General Patton's line during his attack on the French city of Metz. The unit proved invaluable while Allied forces awaited the arrival of a division to fill in the gap. Patton was remembered for being one of the more open-minded generals when it came to the Ghost Army, and they likewise embraced working with him. But even the officials who were less receptive to the unit's unconventional tactics wound up valuing them for their niche service. Number 7. Project Habbakkuk. During World War II, British War Office scientist named Geoffrey Pike came up with the idea of turning icebergs into aircraft carriers. It sounds crazy, but in theory, the massive formations seemed like a convenient and money-saving alternative to building ships for storing and transporting naval aircraft. The British military also saw Pike's idea as a way to protect Allied vessels from German U-boats at a time when steel and other construction materials were in short supply. Known as Project Habbakkuk, the operation commenced in 1943 after receiving the go-ahead from Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Its objective was to create a fortified iceberg that was both economically efficient and easy to fix by mixing wood pulp with the ice. Ideally, the unconventional aircraft carriers would require a simple infusion of water for most repairs. 2,000 feet long and 200 feet wide, each iceberg would be more than twice the size of the Titanic and would have room for 300 aircraft. Using ice, wood, tar, and refrigeration pipes, the project's engineers built a 60-foot-long prototype in Canada's Lake Patricia. It was functional, but there were some unforeseen issues that raised questions about the viability and strength of ice as a building material. By the time the war started turning in favor of the Allies in mid-1943, planes with longer patrol capacities had been introduced, Iceland became available as a permanent base, and radar that tracked U-boats more accurately was developed. As a result, there was less of a need for aircraft carriers, and Project Habbakkuk was abandoned. Number 6. Operation Gladio. During the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency supposedly organized a secret army to resist a Soviet invasion of Western Europe if one were to happen. Codenamed Operation Gladio, the clandestine paramilitary network initially had units in Belgium, France, Greece, West Germany, and the Netherlands. By 1960, it had expanded to all of Western Europe, including neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. The army's existence remained a secret from the public until 1990, when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti revealed it to the world during a speech to his country's Senate. The following weeks and months, officials from several other NATO countries described similar operations. They described hidden stockpiles of weapons and explosives dating as far back as the beginning of the Cold War, as well as hundreds of resistance fighters who were specially trained to fight back against an invasion should the need arise. In his speech, Andreotti said that the mission had been largely scaled back, but that there were still over 600 people on its payroll. He said he decided to expose the operation after Venetian magistrate Felice Casson discovered its existence during an investigation into a 1972 car bombing that was carried out with an explosive from one of the hidden weapons caches meant for Operation Gladio. 3 policemen were killed in the blast. According to Andreotti, 139 weapons arsenals throughout Italy were destroyed the following year, but weapons from several of them were never recovered. U.S. officials initially denied the CIA's involvement in Operation Gladio, describing the allegations as absolute nonsense. Officials have continued to deny their role in the operation, but many members of the public in the U.S. and elsewhere remain unconvinced that American intelligence had nothing to do with the mission. Number 5. Project Cold Feet. In 1961, an American naval aircraft discovered an abandoned Soviet base on an ice floe above the Arctic Circle. It had been abandoned after its runway became unusable due to the shifting ice. Starting the following year, the Central Intelligence Agency led a mission to collect intelligence from the base, codenamed Project Cold Feet. Because it seemed impossible to land an aircraft at the base, 2 CIA agents parachuted onto the property and spent a week exploring it. They were pleasantly surprised to discover that the USSR had not destroyed the base before they abandoned it. When the CIA agents left, they took about 150 pounds of equipment with them for further study. To get back in the aircraft that dropped them off, the agents attached themselves to a line and were lifted by a balloon. The plane then came by, snagged the line, and pulled the agents and cargo aboard. It was more complicated than it sounds, and marked the first operational use of a specially designed system called Skyhook. And it was significant that they pulled it off to begin with, but even more impressive because they did it in challenging conditions, including a fierce wind and low visibility. It even involved some close calls, with both agents nearly being blown away in the wind at various points throughout the process. An analysis of the equipment revealed that the Soviets were working to develop advanced acoustic systems with the goal of detecting submerged American submarines. The CIA also discovered that the Soviet Union's meteorological technology was superior to U.S. developments at the time. Number 4. Project Azorian. In April 1968, a Soviet submarine known only as K-129 sank to the ocean floor off Hawaii. After weeks of searching, the USSR gave up on finding it. Several months later, the U.S. Navy launched a mission to find and photograph the wreck, codenamed Operation Sand Dollar. In just 3 weeks, the Navy located K-129 at a depth of 16,000 feet. 2 years later, in 1970, high-ranking defense officials and the CIA concocted a secret plan to recover the vessel. Codenamed Project Azorian, it was the deepest salvage attempt ever made, at a grand total of around $800 million, more than $4 billion in modern currency. It was also one of the Cold War's most complicated and expensive intelligence undertakings. A vessel called the Hughes Glomar Explorer was built specifically for the expedition. The government pretended that the ship was going to be used for mining. 2 torpedoes and various pieces of equipment were recovered, as well as codebooks and other documents that the CIA was happy to get their hands on. The team also recovered the remains of 6 Russian service members who had gone down with the wreck and gave them a proper burial at sea with military honors. In 1975, Time magazine published an expose about the government's true intentions with the mission, despite the CIA's best efforts to squash the story. The agency remained tight-lipped even after the article came out. Several participants had given interviews over the years, but the exact details of what the mission uncovered are unclear to this day. Number 3. A top-secret mountaintop military base. During the Vietnam War, it was impossible for the U.S. forces to bomb targets in North Vietnam when it was dark or cloudy. To remedy the issue, the CIA and the Air Force established a top-secret radar base atop Phu Pha Thi, a 5,600-foot mountain near the border in neighboring Laos. Dubbed Lima Site 85, the base was manned by CIA staff members who directed American bombers to targets in North Vietnam. U.S. aircraft received navigational information from an automated radio transmitter at the clandestine site. The base proved to be instrumental to the success of Operation Rolling Thunder, a controversial bombing campaign that began in 1965. It was kept secret from the public, like most of America's involvement in Vietnam at the time. It played a major role in the controversial war that many people would eventually come to believe that America had no right to participate in. North Vietnamese forces eventually caught on to Lima Site 85's existence. They initially tried to attack it by air, and when their attempts failed, they surrounded the mountain on foot. A gun battle ensued, and the Americans were evacuated by helicopter. U.S. bombers then destroyed the base to avoid sensitive technology or intel from falling into enemy hands. Number 2. Operation Ivy Bells. After discovering a top-secret undersea communications cable linking 2 Soviet military bases during the 1970s, U.S. intelligence officials decided to tap it. Codenamed Operation Ivy Bells, the clandestine mission entailed sneaking into Soviet territorial waters, which were strictly off-limits to foreign vessels, and attaching listening devices to the cable. The project was thought up and planned by Navy Captain James Bradley, who assumed that the USSR would have placed signs near the cable warning ships not to drop anchor there to prevent the cable from being cut. He also believed that the Soviets had implemented listening devices along the cable to detect intruders. It would be a risky mission, but American officials were too tempted by the prospect of gathering highly sensitive information to ignore the opportunity. Only the most trusted and highest-ranking members of government even knew about the mission, which was paid for with secretly diverted funds that were labeled for use on other projects. Using a specially modified submarine called the USS Halibut, U.S. intelligence operatives entered the Sea of Okhotsk and located the warning signs, which were in place as Captain Bradley had predicted, along with listening devices. Luckily, the Americans managed to maneuver their way around these obstacles. Divers descended 400 feet to the sea floor and attached the listening devices, and returned every few weeks thereafter to retrieve full tapes and replace them with empty tapes. At least one of the listening devices was designed to detach from the cable if it was raised for repairs. In 1981, an NSA agent informed Soviet intelligence officials about the tap, and they promptly removed the listening devices, bringing the operation to an abrupt and unexpected end after nearly a decade of successfully gathering top-secret Russian intel. The agent who gave the operation away had recently retired and was in a lot of debt. He was compromised by the Soviets, who offered him a generous payout in exchange for the information. The American listening device retrieved by the Russians is currently on display at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Moscow. And at number 1, flying aircraft carriers. Several militaries have experimented with the idea of a flying aircraft carrier throughout aviation history. Britain became the first country to commission this type of vehicle in 1915 with the development of 4 23-class Vickers airships. Measuring 535 feet long, each plane carrier was equipped with a portable fighter escort of 3 biplanes slung by hooks on the ship's underside that could be deployed on short notice if need be. Only 4 of the aircraft carriers were ever built. They were never used in combat and were all taken out of service within 5 years for various reasons. But the U.S. military took note of the idea and went on to design its own pair of flying aircraft carriers, the USS Los Angeles and the USS Macron, in the 2 decades following World War I. Commissioned in 1932, the 785-foot-long helium-filled Akron was capable of launching and recovering fighter planes in midair, but it repeatedly experienced flying issues and ended up crashing off the New Jersey coast during a windstorm in 1933, killing 73 passengers. Its sister ship, the Macron, flew at speeds of up to 80 miles per hour and a range of more than 10,000 miles. Like the Akron, it was involved in several accidents, some of which proved to be fatal. In 1935, it crashed off California, effectively ending the U.S. military's experimentation with airborne carriers. The Soviet Union had its own flying aircraft carrier development scheme. Known as the Zveno Project, it was commissioned by Stalin in 1931. Gigantic Russian bombers, such as the TB-1 and TB-3, were refitted to carry small fighter bombers, which were placed either on top of or below the larger plane's wings. The small planes were able to unhook in mid-air to carry out their missions, and in some cases, they were capable of reattaching to the carrier. They first saw combat in 1941 during the beginning stages of the Soviet war against Nazi Germany. The carriers, along with their pint-sized counterparts, were retired in 1942 after participating in 30 air raids against enemy targets. Thanks for watching. Have you ever heard of any of these military operations before this video? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.